Between 1798 and 1837, the stylistic conventions of British literature transformed. This movement overhauled the basic structures of human thought, redefining science, religion, and the concept of the self through a total epistemological, ontological, and theological revolt. To understand the magnitude of this revolt, we have to look at the baseline it was reacting against. From 1660 through the late 18th century, Neoclassicism dominated British thought. Following the religious fanaticism and civic violence of the English Civil Wars, society prioritized stability. Drawing on the scientific revolution, thinkers modeled the universe as an orderly, intelligible mechanism governed by immutable laws. Civic decorum, rational restraint, and universal logic became the highest virtues. That carefully engineered cultural equilibrium collapsed under the compounding pressure of three socio-political disruptions in the late 18th century. The first disruption was the French Revolution. In 1789, early progressives celebrated the storming of the Bastille as the arrival of universal emancipation. William Wordsworth noted that to be alive in that moment was bliss, and to be young was absolute heaven. But the rapid degeneration into the September massacres, the Reign of Terror, and the Napoleonic Wars shattered those utopian aspirations. The resulting disillusionment destroyed the British intelligentsia's faith in political rationalism. The second disruption was the rapid transition to steam-driven industrial capitalism. The widespread mechanization of labor reduced skilled artisans to interchangeable units within factory systems. Massive demographic migrations packed the agrarian populace into unregulated factory centers like Manchester and London, producing severe environmental pollution and social alienation. The third disruption occurred in the countryside. A series of parliamentary enclosure acts privatized and hedged millions of acres of traditional common lands. Stripped of customary foraging rights, smallholders were forced into urban centers. This physical division of the English countryside severed a long-standing ecological and spiritual bond between rural communities and the natural landscape. Rational social engineering and mechanization had promised a perfect society, but delivered mass executions and smog-choked slums. Faced with this external failure, writers abandoned the quest to restructure society. They redirected their revolutionary impulses inward, initiating a program of internal psychological liberation and imaginative renewal. This inward turn required entirely new theories of human perception, bringing us to the first category of our comparative matrix, epistemology. Enlightenment thinkers relied on Lockean empiricism, which viewed the mind as a tabula rasa, or blank slate. In this model, human consciousness is completely passive. It records sensory data from the outside physical environment, acting as a passive mirror reflecting external, objective reality. The Romantics discarded the mirror. Drawing on Immanuel Kant's transcendental idealism, they argued that consciousness actively co-creates phenomenal experience through innate synthetic categories. The mind morphs into an active lamp. It radiates light outward, participating in and shaping the reality it perceives. If the human mind actively shapes experience, we have to ask how this new mind perceives the physical universe differently, which brings us to the shift in ontology. To the Enlightenment thinker, nature was a static, mechanical clockwork composed of inert matter in motion. It was entirely separate from the observer, an object meant to be clinically measured, categorized, and mastered. The Romantics reconceptualized nature as a living, dynamic spiritual organism. It ceased to be an object of clinical observation and became an untamed sanctuary, imbued with a divine vitality that interacts directly with the human soul. Treating a living organism like a machine destroys it. As Wordsworth argued, the analytical intellect murders to dissect. The empirical dissection of the natural world reduces living phenomena to dead parts, effectively severing humanity's emotional engagement with reality. This philosophical divide naturally extended to our second category, theology. This chart visualizes the neoclassical theology of orthodox deism. God was viewed as a remote cosmic clockmaker who engineered a rational universe and then withdrew from active intervention. This framework supported the great chain of being. It established an immutable hierarchy extending from inanimate matter up through plants, animals, humanity, and angelic ranks. Every creature occupied an assigned, fixed station within a highly rational cosmic and social order. The Romantics largely rejected this detached, mechanistic deity. Poets cultivated an immanent pantheism and panentheism, dissolving this hierarchy. They located a sublime, living spirit interfused within the light of setting suns, the ocean, the air, and the mind of man, permeating all physical reality. William Blake executed the most radical theological revolt of the era. He identified the orthodox and deistic God as an oppressive tyrant he named Urizen, a symbol of cold logic, restrictive moral law, and socio-political subjugation. Blake countered this restrictive system by constructing a highly complex personal mythology expressed through striking, hand-colored engravings. Against Urizen, Blake positioned Los, a figure representing the creative imagination. Drawing on mystical doctrines, he asserted that divinity does not sit on a distant heavenly throne. It resides within the human imagination, what he called the human form divine. On the extreme end of the second generation, Percy Bysshe Shelley embraced an uncompromising philosophical atheism. He replaced the anthropomorphic Christian God with a secular cosmic force of constant change and unyielding necessity, entirely indifferent to human dogma. By dispersing divinity into the natural landscape, or internalizing it within the mind's creative faculties, these writers rendered institutional mediation obsolete. They authorized the individual as the ultimate spiritual arbiter. Communicating these radical new realities required an entirely new visual and emotional vocabulary, leading to our third category, aesthetics. In 1757, Edmund Burke established a psychological taxonomy that reshaped how human aesthetic experience was categorized. Burke defined the beautiful through qualities of smoothness, smallness, and symmetry. It evokes feelings of pleasure, social affection, and peaceful domestic calm, the exact rational qualities cherished by neoclassical society. The Romantics obsessed over Burke's countercategory, the Sublime. Generated by vastness, obscurity, and infinite power, the Sublime is perfectly captured here, where tiny village structures are dwarfed by the immense vastness of the Alpine glacier. Confronting this kind of overwhelming power from a position of relative physical safety suspends rational faculties and produces a psychological shock Burke termed a delightful horror. This preference for untamed nature aligned with Jean-Jacques Rousseau's political primitivism. Rousseau argued that humanity is born innately good and spiritually integrated, but becomes corrupted and enslaved by the artificial institutions and competitive demands of modern civil society. Embracing this theory, Romantic writers abandoned the neoclassical ideal of the polished urban gentleman. They elevated the uncorrupted rustic laborer and the child to the status of intuitive mystics. The child was portrayed as retaining a visionary connection to the divine realm that adults forfeit through social conditioning. Prioritizing the immense terror of the sublime and the untainted innocence of the child achieved a specific goal. It shattered the ego's illusion of rational control and served as a rejection of the artificial constructs of a corrupt civilization. To execute this vision, the mechanics of language itself had to evolve. In our fourth category, poetic architecture, Samuel Taylor Coleridge codified the structural dispute by distinguishing between mechanic form and organic form. Mechanic form occurs when an artist forces material into a predetermined external structure, like pressing moist clay into a pre-shaped mold. Neoclassical poetics operated on this model, perfecting the closed heroic couplet. Language was forced to satisfy external rules of metrical symmetry, utilizing end-stopped lines that locked thoughts into symmetrical boxes. Organic form, however, develops from within. The Romantics revived fluid structures like Miltonic blank verse. Here, the structure unfolds concurrently with the poem's internal vital impulse. The meter and stanzaic patterns evolve organically out of the emotional logic of the thought process, spilling over line breaks in continuous waveforms. William Wordsworth coupled this structural shift with a linguistic revolt. He rejected the highly elevated, Latinate poetic diction of the 18th century, insisting that poetry should be composed in a selection of the authentic language really used by common humanity. This rustic focus heavily defined the first generation of Romantics, figures like Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Blake. Wrestling directly with the collapse of the French Revolution, they retreated to agrarian landscapes to seek psychological recovery through memory and personal visionary myth-making. Coleridge identified the psychological engine driving this artistry as the secondary imagination. While mechanical fancy merely rearranges static memories, the secondary imagination actively dissolves, diffuses, and dissipates conventional perceptual categories in order to recreate and unify them into new aesthetic wholes. The second generation, Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and John Keats, grew to maturity in a repressive political climate following the Napoleonic Wars. Viewing the older poets as political apostates, these younger writers embraced defiant political iconoclasm, Mediterranean exile, and intense aestheticism. Keats formulated the theory for this expressive state, negative capability. It is the capacity of an artist to exist in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts, without reaching irritably after fact or dogmatic certainty. Abandoning fixed meter and artificial diction was an ideological necessity. Rigid verse forms simply could not accommodate the unpredictable, organic movements of an actively creating human consciousness. While poetry led the movement, prose underwent a simultaneous structural revolution, departing sharply from the detached, didactic essays of the Enlightenment. If the Enlightenment championed empirical clarity and social decorum, the Gothic novel emerged as its psychological shadow. It plunged deep into the irrational, exploring repressed taboos, the supernatural, and absolute existential terror. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein represents the era's foremost prose achievement. Blending sublime alpine landscapes with trenchant philosophical critique, the novel warns against the hubris of Enlightenment scientism. Victor Frankenstein embodies the failure of cold, analytical intellect, operating without emotional sympathy or a reverence for nature. Concurrently, Sir Walter Scott invented the modern historical romance. Rejecting dry, chronological historiography, he reconstructed the medieval past through vibrant folklore and vanishing traditions, offering readers an imaginative bridge against rapid industrial modernization. Operating at the intersection of neoclassical balance and romantic psychological depth, Jane Austen pioneered the technique of free indirect discourse. This allowed her to capture the subtle, intricate movements of human consciousness while maintaining a strict neoclassical suspicion of unchecked sentimental indulgence. Across genres, romantic prose realigned the narrative lens. Authors stopped judging external societal behavior and began mapping the dark, irrational, and profoundly subjective labyrinth of the internal human psyche. The fully assembled matrix reveals a total recalibration of the human operating system, reaching into every facet of life. The transition was a dialectical synthesis of both worldviews. As objective structure and subjective expression merged, they formed the blueprint for modern psychological interiority. The second-generation Romantics consistently demonstrated this synthesis. John Keats interrogated classical permanence, Percy Bysshe Shelley repurposed Greek drama, and Lord Byron deployed Augustan satire directly within his expressive epics. By dismantling the concept of the mind as a passive recording instrument, the Romantics exalted the autonomous, creative imagination. In doing so, they engineered a new relationship between humanity, art, and the natural environment. The dialectical tension established during this era, between the demand for structured, universal logic and the insistence on expressive liberty, did not end in 1837. It remains the foundational engine driving modern psychology, existential philosophy, and environmental ethics to this day.